Good afternoon, and welcome to the Insight Teen Hour. My name is Frederik. I am from Insight Treatment Programs here in Santa Clarita, or an IOP, or intensive outpatient program for teenagers struggling with drug and alcohol or mental health issues. Today it's Monday, 2 p.m. That's the time where we're going to talk about teen mental health issues. On the Insight Teen Hour, we'll discuss issues that are relevant to families that have teenagers that are struggling with any sort of mental health or drug and alcohol addictions. Today in the studio, I've invited David Ibrahim, who is an LMFT. He's an addiction counselor, a trauma therapist, and he's the owner of Glendale Counseling Services. And he has a lot of experience in working with families and teens that are struggling with addiction. So I felt it was very appropriate to have him come on the show and talk a little bit about his own history, but also talk about how in an outpatient program like Glendale Counseling, how they're working with teenagers and families that are struggling with addiction. They have some services there. EMDR, for instance, is one of them, and some modalities that we don't have at Insight. So I think it would be very interesting for us to get a perspective of that. Welcome to the show, David. Thanks for coming in today.
Hey, thanks, Frederik. Thank you, and all the listeners. Appreciate the time.
Absolutely. So, David, I know when you and I spoke before the show, you sort of described a bit of your childhood and how you were struggling as a teen. And if you don't mind, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that story and, how it was to be you growing up. And, yeah.
Hey, absolutely. Yeah. It'd be a pleasure to share. I was born and raised in New York City, and I come from Queens. I was born and raised in Queens in the 70s. So, I put together some years now. And I grew up in the neighborhood. It was interesting times. My home was an alcoholic home. One of my parents was an alcoholic and a severe alcoholic. And it made it tough for me. My parents went through a divorce when I was younger. It impacted me. It made me feel isolated and alone. And my mother's Greek and my father's Arab. So I come from these mixed cultures too. And my neighborhood was very mixed ethnically. And it was a real melting pot. I always felt at that age, this was the 80s, where divorce still wasn't kind of a common thing yet. And I felt like I was ashamed of myself. I felt like I was a kid from a broken home. I was a latchkey kid. So I grew up young. My neighborhood was very violent, and New York City was wild at that time. I mean, it was just crazy. And I felt really alone. So I started at a young age just hanging out with the wrong people. Like I would interview kids, actually. When I was like 10, 11, I would start asking kids a lot. 8, 9, 10, 11, I would say, do you have both your parents at home? And if they told me their father wasn't around, I would actually hang out with them. And I didn't like to be around the kids that had both their parents, right? I felt uncomfortable, Yeah, Frederik. I felt really ashamed of myself, and I come from strong cultures, So,
and isn't that also... sorry not to interrupt, David, but I feel that's sort of a classic thing, right? That the teens are struggling suddenly to hang out with their old friends. They don't feel they fit in anymore. They feel ashamed, so they don't want to hang out with their old friends. They often start showing signs that they don't want to play the soccer that they usually play, or they don't want to go to school and hang out. They start hanging out with new friends and sort of separating themselves from the old friends, right? Because they feel so bad about what they're going through. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it's a valid point. And once look, this is why it's healthy to have parents that are emotionally attuned to themselves as parents, that as an adult, that they can be in touch with what's going on in themselves. So when they're around their kid or their teen, they can also hold emotional space for their teenagers and their children. Otherwise, they're creating this culture, this family culture, where we don't process emotions in this family. Just get over it or deal with it yourself. And you're putting a lot of responsibility on a little kid that can't handle that, or a teenager that can't handle it. By that point, ideally parents would be emotionally in touch with their own stuff and have worked through whatever baggage they've carried over from their family and whatever kind of distortions or poor emotional, belief systems they've learned, not to process feelings, to be avoidant, to use substances, to go to the wrong places, to be to lack emotion, right? Or to try and regulate self through improper behaviors or whatever it would be, porno, drugs and alcohol, or just avoidance patterns, or just as bad, like a borderline parent in a sense, where they reject their child and create this abandonment attachment wound. Ideally parents would be able to work on themselves first. I always tell parents, make sure, when I work, because I work with a lot of parents also, I'll say, we have to look at what's going on inside you that has laid the system in place, because a lot of times they want to look at the kids only and the teens and think, okay, take my teen and fix them. But it's like, look, you got to do your work as well. And, it's healthy to be accountable and responsible as an adult and not think, it's just the teenager's responsibility to fix himself through the therapy. The parent needs to do their job also. Well, I don't know. Did you have anything you wanted to share around that, Frederik? Or questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think even at Insight, I think this whole idea of that the family needs to be part of the solution is extremely important, right? They need to understand that, hey, the shame we have to take away, right? We need to talk about what really has been going on for you as a parent and, need to be able to support you. And otherwise, it's going to be so hard to hold boundaries, right? If you're struggling with anxiety yourself and you feel so guilty about this anxiety has been put onto your kids, right? And you therefore don't really want to deal with it.
And as a kid, I turned to graffiti, crime, substances. I looked for anywhere to get some type of connection to life, vitality, something that felt better than what I was feeling, alone and isolated and depressed and down and shamed. And now that, obviously if I could turn back the clock, I would have done it differently. My mom tried, she tried to put me in therapy, but I was very defiant. And I kind of was poisoned in a sense by that, by those young. I was
How old were you at that time, David?
I think I was like 11, 12 when my mom tried to put me in therapy. She tried to put me in Alateen. It's Al-Anon for teenagers. And I remember walking into the Alateen meeting, and there was a room of candles out in Queens at this little brick church house in the dead of winter, and a bunch of teens were sitting around the candlelight. I came in. And I sat down, and the guy asked me, why are you here, Dave? And I was like, my father's alcoholic. I don't need to be here. And I never wanted to go back after that, I think the guy told me, like, oh, you're really aware of what's going on. And I was like, I'm done with this crap. And, I was very defiant at a young age. But I was just sitting with so much rage and pain, and I had no outlet, just creative outlets like music and art and whatever I could put my hands on in a sense.
And so, how many years did that go on for, where you were sort of rebelling by, using and?
I went on a rampage. It was like 10 years. It was into my early 20s, and I had gone through multiple arrests as a kid, and then eventually I faced a big sentence, and I pleaded guilty, and they put me in treatment for like a year. And that expunged my record. I started working on myself. I started working through therapy. I fell in love with therapy, actually, and counseling. And I saw a path towards healing. And I thought, this is stuff I can work through. And, at that time, this is why I love like EMDR and intense psychodynamic work. I find it to be really rapid and can be accelerated for a lot of people towards healing. When we here at Glendale Counseling Services, we work with the patients. And sometimes the family. I don't always work with family. Sometimes we work conjointly. Like here, let's say you have a patient at Insight. You refer the teenager over for trauma therapy or the parent. And they will come over and they will stay doing either services with you guys. And then here we'll go ahead and work with them one-on-one and work towards healing whatever the core trauma is and using kind of accelerated techniques in a more lengthy period of time. I see patients for up to 3 hours in one session in the beginning of the work. So we pretty much get all the defenses and anxieties out of the way. We'll get to the core of the issue and really accelerate the pace for the patient to develop strength in their ego capacity, to tolerate feelings and their ability to know what's going on inside them. And sometimes that entails, not working with the parents. I only work with usually we only see teenagers 16 or older. Me, myself, in my caseload, I only see teens 16 or older. I have one of my staff will see, two of my staff will see younger teens, like a 12, probably 13, 14 years old. I don't see teenagers under the age of 16 myself, just because of the way I work and the intensity of the work. It really requires them to have kind of a lot more adaptive capacity in a sense, and I'll work with them directly, and sometimes we don't need the parents to even get involved. The patient heals on their own. They see their parents as limited, because some parents really are, and the patient doesn't have to suffer under that. The patient doesn't have to suffer under that limitation. A parent that cannot or does not want to do their work, they don't want to work on themselves. The patient, teenagers shouldn't have to stay punishing themselves and kind of invested in masochism. Or if we look at it from an EMDR lens, is invested in negative cognitions about themselves, like I'm to blame, or I'm at fault, or I'm not worthy. And then they perpetuate all these behaviors around this cognition, this narrative. The neural pathways will fire up like that, and people can really go into create a mess of their life and destroy relationships and not have to. I mean, who wants to go down that route? Sometimes I hold a lot of compassion, because they try. Teenagers and people in general, when they're traumatized and in pain, they're trying to find a way out, and so they go to substances or maladaptive behaviors, and it's their upside-down method of trying to find a way out, and they get stuck. They end up in, like, the Stranger Things. The Stranger show was pretty dope. I thought it was beautiful, but, I got to watch it with my kids, and that's something I always encourage adult parents. I'll say, hey, do you watch shows with your kids? Do you get into their world? Do you play video games with them and learn how to play the video game? I learned how to play Fortnite to get invested in my stepson's life. He was in love with the game when it came out, and I became really good at it, and we'd play in squads. And I got a microphone. It was like 15 years I hadn't gamed. I grew up as a gamer. Hey, Frederik. I grew up as a video gamer. It was one of my escapes as a kid. It was Atari, and then Nintendo, and then Super Nintendo, and PlayStation, and eventually Xbox. And then I stopped for like 10, 15 years. But my daughter and my stepson and my stepdaughter, they all got me back into video games, because I thought, this is something they really love. And I was like, why don't I play games anymore? Why did I stop? And so, I tell parents, like, hey, play games with your kids. Even when I would play, like, on Fortnite, I'll talk to adults sometimes. I'll be like, hey, are you playing with your kid? Why don't you play more, with video games? Or I tell the kids, go tell your parents to come play on the game with you. But,
Yeah. One of the things I often feel we have to talk to parents about is also to be available to them emotionally, but be available to them even at times where it can be really hard as a parent, right? So I think we've all experienced, when we pick them up from school, hey, when we're driving home, that's a good time for us to engage. And how is school, right? How are you doing today? Mm-hmm. How is it to hang out with your friends? And that's when kids are really overly tired in their head, right? All this social anxiety that's been going on all day in school can be really sort of make their head about to explode, right? They don't want to talk about anything at that time. They just want to go home. So the answer obviously becomes, fine, Mom, it's okay. Let's just move on. And then
usually if but to be honest, Frederik, but to be honest, if that dynamic's established at the teens, then it's because it's been established in younger years in general. And that's why the key is at a young age that the parents get invested on a daily basis. Let your kids yap on for half an hour. Ask them about the names of their friends. It should follow up whenever you're hanging out with your kids. It's like, hey, how is X, Y, and Z doing? How is this person? What's going on there? And listen to what they're sharing with you. They're going to start venting and processing. And the more they do that at a young age, they're going to do it as teens as well. It's not like their hormones kick in and all of a sudden they just kick their parents out of their life. That's typically what happens when they've had dysfunctional relationships in young ages.
Good point. Yeah.
It's not like that for many families that are present to their kids. It's sad when it is. Believe me, and the listeners that are out there that are parents and that are now stuck with the teen that they didn't really develop emotionally together, you can repair that if you do your work. That's my message to the parent. It's like, you do your work, and you might be surprised that you can, repair that relational dynamic with your teenager. The human consciousness is amazing, and it is beautiful, and it is rich and abundant, and very creative. and sometimes we find dysfunctional ways, and many times we can find functional. But I cut you off. I'm sorry. What were you going to say?
No. I just want to say you're absolutely right. There are many families that you see that we work with, right, and that you're working with, where the families don't believe that this will ever change. This relationship is gone for good. This is never going to change. But it's amazing to see how sometimes it can actually be turned around if both are able to change their paradigm a little bit and look at things from a new lens, right?
Yeah. It's so beautiful. I was working with somebody recently, and where they decided they did so much trauma work that, this individual that's of a younger age decided to repair relationships in their life because it was repaired in themselves. And it was a very empowering position for them to realize the love they have and the forgiveness that's available when the kind of rage gets drained out and the pain gets drained out, the guilt gets drained away. And all of a sudden, love is the softest alchemy of the soul. And it's at the bottom. And it gets buried under heavy chemicals like rage and guilt and pain, grief, and when those chemicals start lifting out, in a sense, the love lifts and forgiveness goes with it, man. Or forgiveness lifts and love follows at the very end. And that kid, that teen, that adult, they're free. That's true liberation of psyche. But, it takes work. Yeah, it takes work.
It takes a lot of work. And that's back to my point was that, sometimes we as parents, we're willing to do the work when we feel good and when we feel, hey, this is the right time for me. But sometimes, at 10 o'clock at night when the kid then shows up in our room and wants to chat and we're all tired and we don't feel this is the right time, then unfortunately, we shut it down, right? Because now we're not ready, because we have to get ready for the next day, and we're stressed and we're tired, and we need to just...
Frederick, that's right.
So
this is the crux of modern times. It's tough because you're right. Right? If I'm a parent, right? I have 3 kids, 2 stepkids, one biological daughter. But if I'm stressed out and I'm burnt out, it's so hard to hold emotional space for anyone else. And that's, this is where we learn how to start juggling different balls relationally, right? I have a wife, I have kids, I have myself, self-care, I have friends, a family. These are balls we learn to juggle. But it's a valid point you're making. A lot of it is learning how to be able to take care of yourself enough and not burning out, especially for workaholics that like to achieve success financially. A lot of times we see this with parents. A lot of times it's typically the father, but not all the times. We see it with the mother a lot too now. And, that parent is so focused on making money and success that they don't realize that they've separated from their child. And what I've seen many times in my career, and I spent many years in treatment centers. I have a second license as an advanced alcohol and drug counselor. And I worked with over 1,000 addicts and their families over the last 10, 11 years. And what I would see so many times is the kind of wealthy parent that's so successful and a top CEO or CFO or something successful in their business, but absolutely no connection to their child for years because now they regret it, 15, 20 years later. Because at some point we come back to relationships. We're wired like that. Most of us are. As human beings, we're hardwired for love and relational connection. And you can have money to a certain degree, but how much money can you have? At some point, we miss relationships. And hopefully, these parents are doing their part to repair and say, okay, what do I do to fix this? And the message needs to get out about balance. Have success financially, but have success in your family too, emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually. Be connected. Have the balance. How much money can you have?
True. Yeah, it's rare on that note, right, David? It's rare that you hear people in their own...
You can't buy relationships. It's prostitution.
That's right. And we often go in our graves say, oh, I wish I would have, had more connection. I would have worked less. You rarely hear people say, oh, you know what? I wish I would have worked more. I wish I would have spent more time in the office. That would have made me happier here in my old age.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah, that's a good
it's
point.
very rare we hear that version of the life story.
True.
Right? So I think we just need to remember that.
There's like a famous Harvard study. It came out a few years ago where I forgot it was the longevity of a multitude of people's lives, and they found that the ones that were happiest at the end of their life were the ones that had healthy relationships. You don't lay on your deathbed saying, I wish I made more money.
No, that's so true. Okay, and David, unfortunately, time is flying. So we have to go into a short little break here. You are listening to KHTS 98.1 FM, and this is the Insight Teen Hour. And in the studio today, I got David Ibrahim from Glendale Counseling, and we will be back in a few minutes, so hang in there. Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Insight Teen Hour. So today I have David Ibrahim in the studio, an LMFT and an addiction counselor from Glendale Counseling Services. And David and I are talking about teen addiction. We're talking about David has a great story of his own. When he grew up, he was struggling as a teen and got into using drugs and even selling drugs, and was doing that for a long time in his young life. David, now that we're starting the program again, I was wondering, when you were telling your own story, I was wondering, but I know you grew up with parents who weren't so, involved in your life, so to speak, and it got divorced. Your mom tried to get you into therapy.
My mom was involved a lot, but my dad left, so I always felt, he was alcoholic. I felt personally that at that young age it impacted me. And then I worked on repairing the relationship with my father, which was tough. When somebody's in the throes of severe alcoholism, I mean, it really does a number on people.
Mm-hmm. I know that we are. You and I are both often meeting parents that are sort of, let me start with another question. That is actually, what do you feel in your experience? What would you feel would have made the biggest difference back in your life with your parents? Obviously, besides the clear thing about your dad not using, but was there something about back then, something you experienced back then that you really felt, or a way that your parents could have been there for you, that you wish would have taken place back then? Or is there a message you can give to other parents besides what you said before, being present?
Well, it's interesting, I always wanted the kind of connection with, especially with my father. I used to always dream when I was a kid. I would go play sports or do stuff with him. And it was tough. He was tired. He would go to the movies and pass out. I mean, he was a tired man. I hold a lot of love for both my parents. I want to be open about that, and I forgive them, right? They did what they could do with the tools they have. My parents were immigrants when they came to America at a young age, and they weren't given a lot of tools. They just were surviving in many ways. I mean, ideally, I personally, for myself, I would have loved to just have a lot of fun and open-hearted connection and play games and talk, and be able to talk about my life as, on a daily basis or a weekly basis. Right. And in some ways, it kind of reflects a therapeutic relationship, where parents can be almost like the child's therapist, right? And there's a reality to that. It's the same with couples therapy. When people go into couples therapy, we're teaching the patients how to be therapizing each other, how to hold feelings, how to be vulnerable, how to hear what the other person's feeling and needing, how to reflect that back, how to empathize, how to figure out solutions, compromise, agreements, amends, repair ruptures, like, Dan Siegel, I think, says that a lot. Now, so I would have wanted that type of connection, emotionally, that parents could be attuned to me and talk and give me wisdom, like in terms of repairing dynamics, help me understand my daily life, And as a kid, I grew up with a kind of racial identity. My last name is pronounced Ibrahim. I didn't tell you that earlier, but my father comes from an Arab Muslim family. They're Palestinian Israelis. It's a very complex dynamic there. They were Palestinian in 1948. And then they were supportive of Jewish people and Arabs together. They wanted peace, and my family ended up, turning into Israeli Arabs, which is very, it's kind of like a 20-30% of Israel is Arab Muslims and Christians. But my father came from that dynamic, so he himself was confused. And then I grew up in a neighborhood that was ethnically mixed. And when hip-hop came out and rap, and I felt like I came from a mixed family. My family, they have different colors in our family of skin. And I grew up a lot of racism out face, reverse racism, where kids would call me white boy. I mean, I grew up in black, Latino, Asian, Indian, mixed ethnic, Italian, Greek. I mean, you can name it. And I was confused in my own identity. I was mixed, like Arab and Greek. It's kind of like two sides of the world, Western and Eastern, two different sides of the world. But I'm in New York City, so I always feel like that's my home. So I wish I had, parents that could hold space for that at a young age. They couldn't. It was hard. It was hard for them. Right? And this is kind of like idealized, Yeah, I wish for that, but
we don't always. Yeah, we don't always get it how we want it, right? We're just going to deal with it in the moment, and that's what many kids do. But on that note, David, so what I'm getting at is you and I both work with a lot of families, of course, where the teens are defined. They, as you explained, you did not want to go to treatment. You didn't understand why you had to be sitting in a teen Al-Anon meeting at the time. You didn't find any value, and you
a lot of times the teens are pushed in,
right? So what would your advice be to parents out there who are listening who has teens that have that are given up, that don't believe in treatment? They don't want to show up for treatment.
Yeah.
They I know, we obviously at Insight, we're dealing with teens that sometimes is a higher level of acuity, right? So we have more defiance going on than you probably do in a traditional outpatient setting. But what would your advice be? Like, would you wish that your mom would have pushed you hard, would have said, you know what?
Oh, yeah. My mom pushed me a lot. But this is the tough love conversation. It's like the old school tough love.
Yep, exactly. Yep. What is your opinion on that? Does it work? Does it work with kids nowadays? What is your advice to parents?
Research varies, but I know there's also research that shows like 50% of people that are forced into treatment will actually leverage the benefits of the treatment, or it's somewhere around that 51%. I don't know the number. I haven't looked at the research recently, but and I've seen it with my own two eyes a lot of the times where people are pushed to go into treatment, and they go into treatment, and then they start realizing, that they do have issues, and they're kind of putting an incubator that can really sweat the pain out and all the process. And when you're amongst other teens or peers of your age group, and you start realizing like all these different type of triggers you have as well, and connections, and it can be a very vulnerable environment. And that's a real sacred space for catharsis, like for healing to occur. So, personally, I'm not going to tell people go push your kids no matter what. I mean, it's a very complex dynamic, right? It's like, well, I would say first, go get professional help yourself as parents, right? Go get the therapy, the therapist that can understand addiction, because not all therapists do. And you're better off being with a therapist that also has some type of credential in addiction. I have a second license in addiction, so that would be ideal because that takes 10 years almost to get, just like a license for therapy, right? It can take many years. But it just has an extensive experience of education and technique and knowledge. And I would suggest parents go to that type of person that's been around and understands. Always, I would say, lead with compassion and love. If you have rage in you as a parent, then you got to go work on yourself first before you confront your kid. You're going to make a hot mess of things. And it's better that the parent work on their own rage and their own pain. And then after a few months of healing some of that, maybe all of it, some people can heal all their rage and pain that they've been carrying themselves from their, intergenerationally. Then they can deal with their kid at a different level, or their teen, I'm saying, and be able to sit in front of them compassionately with love in their heart, and be able to hold space, and maybe do what I call a carefrontation, right? To be able to caringly confront their child. They listen. Well, first of all, I can tell you, if my own kid, myself, I'll talk to you about that. My own kid steps out of line with substances, that's going to really upset me, and this needs to be worked on immediately. Like, I don't want to see my kid go down the drain. Yeah, and my kids should even have to go to substance. Where am I that they would have to go to that? Where did I fail? What's the rupture there that I didn't repair? They're going to fix it on their own with substances, right? But, I would say to the parents to work on yourself first for a few months, and because if the kid's smoking weed, it's not going to make a difference now or tomorrow. But if they're doing something heavy like heroin, then that's, concerning. They can die in a heartbeat. They can be dead. The thing about marijuana now, too, this is not normal weed from the 80s. This is a hybrid with high levels of THC that never existed on Earth. We never had high levels of THC like this, or dopamine like crystal meth. 1,000% dopamine it activates in the brain. Like, nothing on earth can activate that level of dopamine. The brain's not even designed to handle that. That's why people go into psychosis with marijuana now, or they go into psychosis with crystal meth, and it literally deteriorates the brain. So, I'm always on the side of, like, help people get sober and get help. Now, you shouldn't be throwing them into some conversion clinic where they're telling them they're not allowed to practice whatever sexuality they believe in or something, and they're, banging them over the head with Bibles or whatever it is. I mean, no offense, but this is not going to work either. I deal with so many teens that have come in and that are also young adults, and they've been through these type of therapies that are more traumatizing than their own parents have been. And the parents are like really stuck in rigid belief systems. They think this is going to help their kid, and they don't realize it's a catastrophe. There's healthier ways to work and much more compassionate and loving ways. Like if you're really spiritual or religious, then, banging a kid over the head with a religious book is not the way to go. There's no love in that. That's rageful. That's violent. That's sadistic and masochistic because it's a very damaging system. This doesn't help people. Not in my experience. I can tell you that much. So, that's what I suggest is to get help yourself as a parent first and address your own triggers. If you have rage or anger issues, address that first and see what's stuck. I love ISTDP as a technique for that type of work. It is phenomenal, and it is really one of the most richest forms of therapy I've ever seen. And I've trained in a lot of different techniques. And EMDR is great for like situational traumas and some forms of complex trauma, but parents that suffer from rage and anger, they really should work on it. Whatever technique they're going to use, like to address it and get underneath it and see what's stuck. Some of it can just be old material from years ago, and they can heal that stuff. That stuff is healable. That which is psychological is healable. It's emotionally stuck material that you can actually heal, and then not project it on your child and not treat them like they're your own parent or your own brother or sister or whoever messed up around you growing up. That, you look at your kid and you're like, I don't want you to become like this. And.
You mentioned before, David, you said before, the psychosis, and you can get it from this, and of course THC, and that how the THC is so prominent or potent at the moment. But I also, now that we talk about those kind of things, and because you're an addict specialist and counselor, I just want to bring up the fentanyl, right? I think having any conversation these days about teens and addiction and not talking about fentanyl seems almost crazy, right? Because it is, I can't stress enough, and holidays are coming up, and we know that is a stressful period of time, and fentanyl is out there. We know our kids are overdosing on it because it is so potent and strong, right? And it's being laced into all sorts of other more traditional drugs, right? Like Xanax and Oxycontin and what have you. Mm-hmm. And the kids are just, they're consuming those pills, and they don't know that there's fentanyl in it. Is there anything, just because I'm bringing up the topic, is there anything there, David, that you feel, hey, you want to advise parents on this topic?
I mean, yeah, it's really sad, Frederik, what's going on. And a lot of times people are naive. They're dealing, sometimes we can be really naive as people, and people are out there addicted to substances. They might think they're a drug dealer, has good intentions, or is a kind person or a loving person, but that guy's hustling, man. And this day and age, this is some really sick hustle where they don't care. A drug dealer doesn't care, right? The kid's gonna die. I didn't grow up like that myself. I actually used to be the type of person that I'd tell my people that I work with, hey, you're doing too much. You should slow down. Or I'd stop seeing customers. I'd be like, I don't want to. I'd feel guilty for them, and I couldn't live with it. But I became a therapist, so my conscience is pretty deep, and my guilt is pretty deep, and it's very beneficial in the right areas, right? But people that are selling drugs and they're just going to scrap it with fentanyl, they don't care, man. These are sociopathic people. They don't care that cut will kill. And that's real sickness. And I feel, so anyway, your question was, what would I say? What was your question again, Frederik? Sorry.
No, I think, honestly, I just wanted us to have a conversation about it, right? I like the more people are out there telling parents, hey, look, it's the real deal. It's not just something that happens to the kid that are using meth and doing a lot of hard drug. This is, unfortunately, right now, I feel that these things, we see kids that are overdosing who are not hard addicts and who are just, but who are taking a Xanax pill, right? That they have bought somewhere.
Well, and I've heard people see a lot of times with heroin and different type of opioids, the addict will think they really mastered it. And I've seen this a few times. And I remember I used to see people, especially when I was in treatment, where they would overdose multiple times and they were like okay with skirting death. And they always felt like they weren't going to die. But reality is they will die, and they do die. And a lot of times when people heal their pain, they look back on their past just like I have. It's like, oh, my God, I wish I knew I could have done this work at a younger age. I love it when teens come in and, young adults in their early 20s, and they start healing. And, they have their whole future ahead of them. I mean, I went through almost 10 years of therapy, and I finally feel I feel completely healed from my past. And also I see toxic people for who they are. They're unaccountable, not able to do the work, and I get it. And I don't need to be around that anymore. But, and I don't have to be that, right? But for this type of fentanyl situation, it's something to be concerned about. And coming back to your question earlier, Frederik, about, should they force their kid in and this and that? I mean, if carefrontation, do it with love. And and you might find your kid is grateful after. I've seen many kids, I'm calling kids teens and young adults. I've seen many people look to their parents after treatment, 30, 60, 90 days in, and they completely sing a different tune, and they have a different bond. They went through the family sessions together. They did all this beautiful work, and all of a sudden, they look back on us as clinicians, and they'll whisper, dude, I wish I did this. I wish I did it earlier. I feel like I messed up. And they came in so resistant. I used to joke around, especially when I was in treatment. I go, the more resistant they are, the more healing potential they have, right? And more love and forgiveness is in them as well. And those would be a lot of the, kind of quote unquote knuckleheads would come in, not want to do the work, but not want to be there, be forced in. But then all of a sudden, a few weeks in, they heal stuff. They start opening their heart again. The love comes through, and you see these beautiful people, man. I mean, addicts are some of the most beautiful people you could ever meet in your life. And some of the most sensitive people, so sensitive and deep and rich in spirit. And they're sensitive to the world, and they're trying to cover it instead of honoring that and learning how to make sensitivity a strength. And how to have tools to deal with the sensitivity. That's the beautiful part of therapy. It can give us a lot of tools to deal with sensitivity.
That's true. And parents often come in and say things like, my kid, he has changed. He doesn't care about me anymore. He doesn't care for our family. He just wants to be destructive and defiant. And I say, look, your kid is so emotional. That's why he's doing all this. He has so much love and so much compassion in him, but he's stuck. And he just, he's just at a point where he just can't show it right now, but it's all there. You guys just have to help him, and everybody has to help him get that out again, right? Typically, kids that are struggling because they are so emotional, right? Because emotions are so important to them, and relationships are so important to exactly those teens or those kids, right? So I think often that's being forgotten by parents when they're going through all this hard time, right? That they start seeing their teens as being defiant and not wanting to have a relationship with them or not caring about their feelings or what they're going through. But that's usually not what's happening, right? They just are stuck. They just can't help themselves at this point.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way you help the parent, see something from a different lens that they might not be aware of, and it's good for them to understand that, Except a lot of times parents they have their own blocks there.
Absolutely, see things from a different perspective, right? That's sometimes what needs to happen for things to move in a different direction. Well, David, unfortunately, we're going to go into a short little break again, but we'll be back in a few minutes, and then we can talk. I would love for you to talk shortly on what EMDR really is, because I know we don't have EMDR as part of our program. And a lot of parents are obviously curious about, hey, what is that? Why does everybody talk about EMDR, and why is it so effective on some teens? So when we come back after the break, we'll talk more about that. In the meantime, tune in. You're listening to KHTS 98.1 FM, and this is the Insight Teen Hour. Welcome back to the Insight Teen Hour. My name is Frederik. I'm from Insight Treatment Programs, and here in the studio today, I got David Ibrahim, who is an LMFT at Glendale Counseling Services. David, we don't have that much time left of the Insight Team Hour. But here in the end, I know in your practice or at Glendale Counseling Services, I know you guys are doing a lot of EMDR. You're using that with teens that are struggling and of course also adults. But can you tell us just what is EMDR? For the listener out there, how can you simplify that?
EMDR is a full form of therapy in itself. It's the most researched form of therapy that's ever been out there. It's been around the last 30, almost 40 years. It's created by Dr. Francine Shapiro. Stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And it basically has to do with helping the brain get out of stuck old limbic system traumas, emotional stuckness in a sense, pathways that got blocked and that are still showing symptoms in the present moment, whatever those symptoms are. That could be anxiety, depression, ruminations, PTSD. And then it gets the frontal cortex online and shifts the material through so that it can heal essentially and desensitize it and then reprocess it with different narratives that the patient can see it from a different perspective now, whatever trauma they've been through. They can look at it and not hold a negative impact on themselves. Their kind of core belief about themselves is positive, that they can say, I'm strong now, or I'm safe now, or I'm loved now, or I have worth now. And look back at that memory and actually feel that organically. It's a beautiful technique. And, we're an EMDR clinic. We specialize in trauma and addiction at Glendale Counseling Services. We work extensively with individuals that suffer from trauma and addiction. And then EMDR is beautiful because it can be applied. I use it sometimes for addiction as well. Like I had a patient come in that wanted to use it on marijuana use. We got them sober. They got to get off the weed, and we desensitized all that material and worked with some traumas, and they're up and running in their life at full function, where sometimes they would have gone into a treatment center. And so it just depends, Like sometimes people come in and I'll send them to treatment. It's pretty common if they have a high level of substance use. And we try and get them sober, and they can't with the work, like within if it's in a short amount of time, like several sessions, then I'll say, you need IOP, detox, residential, whatever they show me, I feed them back. And I go, this is what I'm going to encourage you to do. And then you can conjointly see me. But, and sometimes we get a lot of times actually referrals from other patients that their therapist wants them to do EMDR. So they've been in therapy for 2-3 years, or they're at a clinic. They left the residential, they're going into IOP, and now they want to see an EMDR therapist, and they come in, either me or my staff, and, we work with them conjointly with their treatment teams or with the other therapists. This happens a lot. I get a lot of referrals from other therapists that will come in for themselves for therapy or send family members or send patients, and we'll do EMDR work on whatever material stuck or ISTDP work. It's typically I use both. Depends on what they're presenting with. But EMDR is amazing. It's the American Psychological and American Psychiatric Association hold it at the gold standard of therapies as a gold standard. It reaches their highest level of trauma treatment-focused therapies. And so does the Department of Veteran Affairs and the Department of Defense. They made a big contract recently with EMDR, the EMDR organization, and they want to treat combat. I work for combat vets extensively. I'm an advanced EMDR therapist. I work hundreds of patients using EMDR, and I see a lot of times the EMDR therapists that are coming out these days, they don't know how to use EMDR. And I train EMDR therapists, and what happens is they don't have enough kind of strength with it. I was lucky. I worked out at 2 clinics full-time that were EMDR clinics, and I got to learn it extensively on different protocols, and I love it. But I'm also an ISTDP therapist, so the 2 of them I love the most. But EMDR is very powerful, and it's a rapid form of therapy for healing. And a lot of times,
sorry for interrupting. I was just curious, how many sessions do you usually start with? Is it 12 sessions or?
EMDR usually can heal us one trauma. If it's just one trauma, it could be 3 sessions. Sometimes in one session, I see a patient for 90 minutes, and boom, we completed everything, that one trauma, and they're good back in their life. Sometimes it's 3. If there's more traumas, it can be 12. And it depends how much extensive trauma they have. Sometimes, I'll meet a patient for several months, but usually we're a short-term therapy. Our work is 3 to 6 months on average. People come in, they do the work, they heal, they stop. They don't need therapy anymore, ideally.
Unfortunately, David, thank you for all the great information today. We're about to be ending the show for today. You're listening to the Insight Team Hour. And David, thank you very much for being on the show today. If anybody wants to reach out to you, where can they reach you?
Glendale Counseling Services.com. And it has my phone number and contact information there. And we're located in Glendale, Los Angeles.
Beautiful. Thanks for your time, David. Thanks for your input. And tune in next weekend next Monday at 2 p.m. to the Insight Teen Hour on KHTS 98.1 FM.